Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing It Came From The Network. Topic of this It Came From The Network, ECW Hardcore Heaven 1996. Now before we jump into this, I grade everything here on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. Let's jump right into the show. We start off with Joel Gertner, who at the time was just an announcer, opening the show, only to be caned by the Sandman, who then brings out his manager at the time, Missy Hyatt, and they bring back Bob Ortiz, who had previously been an announcer. I don't know or remember what the story was, why Bob Ortiz wasn't there for a little bit, but this was him coming back to be the announcer again, which ultimately led to Gertner joining the Dudley Boys and being their personal ring announcer / manager. This is a cool opening segment, kind of what you would expect from an ECW show. That leads us right into our first match. We get Shane Douglas going up against Mikey Whipwreck. This is a really fun opener. Shane is one of the pillars of the company, one of the guys you think of when you think of ECW. Mikey is one of the great underrated talents of ECW, a guy that could wrestle any style, that could wrestle with anyone from the cruiserweights like Tajiri and Super Crazy to the hardcore guys like Funk or Foley or Sabu, or put on a mat-based match with someone like Shane Douglas or Eddie Guerrero. Just a great talent and kind of a catch-all, go-anywhere-you-can type guy. Ultimately, Shane Douglas picks up the win here. I'm giving this one a 4. Next up in the ring, we have Joey Styles, who says he can't believe what he's about to do, which brings out Baron Von Stevie, aka Stevie Richards, dressing up like Baron Von Raschke, and Blue Dust, aka the Blue Meanie, dressed up as Gold Dust, except in blue, with his valet Patricia, who I don't remember Patricia at all. She was an attractive lady. I'm gonna assume, and please don't take this the wrong way, because I know ECW and how they book talent. I'm gonna guess that she was a dancer from a local gentleman's club in Philadelphia, that they got to do this for the night. This is really funny, really cool. Kind of the precursor and what would lead us into the BWO, these parodies that Stevie Richards and the Blue Meanie were doing, and then eventually they were joined by Nova, which eventually became the BWO. Kind of a funny little spot here. And we'll talk about that more at the end, how the different things that they implement onto the show, whether it be comedy, hardcore wrestling, straight up wrestling. They gave you basically a wrestling variety show. That's followed up by the FBI coming out, JT Smith and Little Guido at the time. They bring out Sal Balomo, who had been a mainstay of the early Eastern Championship Wrestling version of ECW. So it was a nice touch to bring him out here as part of the FBI. That brings out their opponents, which is going to be the Dudley Clan. Not yet the Dudley Boys of Devon and Bubba. This would have been Bubba Ray and Big Dick Dudley, who were joined by Chubby Dudley, Sign Guy Dudley, and DW Dudley, which is what they call him here, but he went by Dances with Dudley. I wonder if they went back and altered that, because I always remember them calling him Dances with Dudley on the show. I wonder if it was altered because of the stereotypical nature of it. It's quite possible, but other stuff has went through. Maybe other stuff hasn't been caught. I know Joey Styles did a lot of redubbing of his commentary based off of them trying to scrub the music out. This leads us right into the match. Big Dick and Bubba Dudley going up against Little Guido and JT Smith. This is an okay match. Ultimately, the FBI pick up the win here by DQ. Devon Dudley comes out, and he was kind of doing this thing where he was a heel, where the rest of the Dudley clan was faces, and him and Big Dick were kind of fighting for control of the Dudley family. This was cool. It felt like just another building block into that story. The match itself wasn't much of anything. I'm giving this one a 2. Next up, we have a match that I could hear Joey Styles promoting for years and years after. We have Taz going up against the Polar Bear Paul Varlins, and I think this was put on their Extreme Warfare compilation tape they sold at the time. It was one of those commercials like Extreme Warfare that they would run on all the ECW shows that this was part of. And if Paul Varlins doesn't stick out to you as a wrestling fan or even an MMA fan, he was an early MMA guy that was on some of the early UFC cards before it was even called MMA. It was just called shoot fighting, which this is what this was called. This was called a shoot fight. To me, I gotta give Taz and probably Paul Heyman a ton of credit for realizing what was going on with UFC at the time, and even Pride over in Japan, and being the first wrestling people, and they may have been more before them, I know Japan had some, but the first wrestling people in America to bring it into American wrestling with the style, to infuse that MMA style, which is kind of prevalent now. Because ultimately, if we're being honest, MMA is just wrestling that's a shoot. But I digress. Going back to the match. This was considered a shoot match. The couple things that stood out here. Taz and his camp had the Eliminators, Shane Douglas and Rob Van Dam, which was a little bit odd, maybe just sticking up for the ECW. You had Team Taz, which were probably House of Hardcore students that he just brought out with him. Saturn was out there too. Ultimately, Saturn gets involved in what is a rather quick match to help Taz get the chokeout win here. I think the spectacle of this and the fact that they used it to build Taz's credibility were a lot better than what the match was. Taz did pick up the win here. I'm giving this one a 2-2. I don't think it was that good. I think it's pretty skippable. On a card where we're going to see a lot of really good stuff later, this just didn't work. And maybe it's because it's early fortes into that crossover thing that we would see guys like Severn and Shamrock do, and even Tito Ortiz later on and King Mo. This just didn't work for me. Next up, we get an in-ring segment with Raven and Stevie Richards. Stevie's bringing him out a new woman who he refused, Blue Dust. Both Kimono Wanalea and Beulah McGillicuddy had left Raven at this point, and Raven wanted the trashiest, bottom of the heap, most deplorable woman that Stevie could find. So Stevie brings out Peach, aka Lori Fullington, the Sandman's ex-wife. This was all part of a mind game, psychological warfare that Raven was having with Sandman at the time, trying to get in his head. Obviously, Sandman comes out again with Missy Hyatt and basically says, this isn't going to bother me. She's my ex-wife. You want my sloppy seconds, stuff of that nature. Very questionable now stuff, but at the time, it worked. It was what it was. This is also the segment where I believe Nova first debuted with Raven and joined his flock here. That leads us right into our match. We have Raven defending the ECW Heavyweight Championship against a surprise opponent. That surprise opponent, Bam Bam Terry Gordy. And let me tell you, this was after Terry Gordy had his incident on the plane which caused brain damage and was kind of a shell of the wrestler he had been before. And I'm not knocking the guy. I absolutely love Terry Gordy. But this Terry Gordy was a different animal. The reason I bring that up is because I do think this is Terry Gordy's last great match. And I have to contribute that to Raven. Raven structured this match around what Terry could still do, who Terry was, what Raven could do to make Terry Gordy look great. Because even though Raven's a world champion here, Terry Gordy's a guy that looks like $1 million here. He looks like he could be a world champion. He looks like a serious threat. He looks like the Terry Gordy that was the UWF world champion or wreaked havoc in World Class Championship Wrestling, or was one of the dominant tag team members in the Miracle Violence collection. He looked like Terry Gordy again. This was a wild brawl. Tommy Dreamer and Primetime Brian Lee get involved. Ultimately, Raven does pick up the win here. A fantastic match, followed by one of the most iconic moments in ECW history. We see everybody out again, Sandman comes out, Beulah, Peaches, the battle lines are being drawn, and we see a surprise. Probably one of the most shocking things I've ever seen in wrestling. We get Tyler Fulling, aka the Sandman's son. Raven has corrupted the Sandman's son, who tells Sandman that he's not his father anymore. He worships Raven. And wow, you want to talk about shocking, you want to talk about insane storylines? It is stuff like this that made ECW what it was. Yes, the matches were great. Yes, the violence was crazy. But stories like this that you've never seen in wrestling, this would have been something you may have seen on a TV show like Dallas or All My Children. This was dark. This was twisted. This was revolutionary. Using a young kid, and I don't know how old Tyler was here. I think he may have been 7 or 8. In the way he used him here, it was just phenomenal. One of the great stories with all the interweaving of Dreamer and Raven and Raven's flock and Sandman being woven in here. I mean, Raven had 2 serious feuds going at the same time. His ongoing feud with Tommy Dreamer, his feud with the Sandman. This was all phenomenal. I'm giving this a 5. Next up, we have basically the starts of 3 matches that I'm going to lump all into one thing because it kind of felt like it did. We start off with the Eliminators going up against the Gangsters, who are jumped by the Bruise Brothers, which brings out the Samoan Gangsta Party, which, if you don't know, the Samoan Gangsta Party is Sammy the Silk and Mac Daddy Kane. Sammy the Silk is actually Samu from the Head Shrinkers, and Mac Daddy Kane would go on to be Rosie later on, the superhero in training. And basically all 4 of these teams brawl. That settles down. The Gangstas are out of the building, so now we're going with the Eliminators with the Bruise Brothers. Again, that breaks down. These teams get involved. Now Axelrod and Hack Myers come out, which sets up Axel and Hack going up against the Samoan Gangsta Party, which again, that breaks down. And all 5 of these teams are now fighting with each other in a big pull-apart brawl. On the show, we're seeing a lot of the tropes of ECW, the chaos of ECW here. We had the comedy, we have the chaos, we had the soap opera story, we had the great matches. You could see what I meant here earlier when I mentioned this was like a wrestling variety show. You get a little bit of everything. You get to laugh, you get to cry, you get to wonder at basically a demolition derby type thing going on here. None of these matches had any conclusion. It all ended up in just a big brawl. I'm giving this all a 3. I thought it was a good segment, and I know ultimately later on it would lead to other things, but for here, I got to grade it as part of this show. Now going from that, we have Pitbull number 2 defending his ECW TV championship against Lionheart Chris Jericho. To me, Chris Jericho always had the it factor. Even back here, you could see there was something different about Jericho than there was about most other wrestlers. The thing that makes Chris Jericho and other wrestlers other people, he had that star capability, he had that charisma. This was a phenomenal match. I really enjoyed this. Pitbull number 2 is not a guy that's known for putting on great matches. Although if you go back and watch, he has some really good ones. And part of that is he doesn't stray from what he should be doing. He's a muscle-bound power guy here. He's wrestling like that. This was a really fun match. Pitbull 2 had Francine with him, which brings out Shane Douglas, who was feuding with them. He tries to kiss Francine. That brings out Pitbull number 1, who's in a cast, because Francine gets wiped out by everybody fighting on the floor. This had a little bit of the ECW chaos mixed with some great in-ring work. Ultimately, Jericho picks up a surprising win at the time because Jericho had never won a championship on a nationwide program yet, so it was a little bit of a surprise. They shake hands afterwards. There's more with Shane. I'm giving this a 4. I thought it was really good. That's followed up by Tommy Dreamer going up against primetime Brian Lee. This is yet another part of the Dreamer and Raven feud. Brian Lee was basically Raven's enforcer, Raven's guy to do his dirty work. This was a really fun ECW style brawl. They brawl through the crowd, they brawl out on the street, they brawl across the street, they're hitting each other into garage doors, they're slamming each other on the street outside, they wrestle all over the building, and it's considered a weapons match, which I don't remember if this was one of the bring your weapons to the arena nights or not. It probably was. Ultimately, Dreamer picks up the win, only to be immediately jumped by the Bruise Brothers and Brian Lee, who then bring him to the crow's nest, basically where Joey Styles sits. And there's a cut in the video because this was put out on video cassette. They edit it to where they're already up on the crow's nest, and we get another one of those iconic ECW moments. If you watched ECW, you've seen this in the opening a million times, where there's a bunch of tables stacked up outside of the crow's nest, and Brian Lee just basically chokeslams Dreamer off through the tables. Stuff like this, moments like this, are really what set the tone for ECW and made ECW what it was. This was really fun. I'm giving this a 4. Last but not least, we get to the main event of the show, Sabu versus Rob Van Dam. And before I get into the actual match, I want to mention, they say it on commentary, there was an hour break between the last match and this match because there was something on the ring that broke. This was the night, again, if you watched ECW, you heard Joey Styles mention this a million times when he talked about the night that Kimona Wanalea danced atop the ECW arena. This was that night. She basically stripped for the fans while the ring was being fixed. I mention that because about 2 minutes into the match, the ropes break. Now, they don't break where they're cut, or they just kind of get very, very loose. And you would think something like that would hinder guys like Van Dam and Sabu, two guys that are known for their high-flying aerial offense. I don't think either guy even lost a step. It almost enhanced it, because it enhanced the danger of what they were doing, the unpredictability of what they did. And kudos to both these guys. Sabu, more so than Van Dam here, because he went further and went crazier than Van Dam did. Sabu absolutely threw caution into the wind and was willing to do moonsaults off these ropes that didn't look like they were even holding him. And it seemed like he didn't care if he lived or died. He seemed to be, as his name would say, as his catchphrase would say, suicidal, homicidal, and genocidal. These guys had an absolutely fantastic match. I would say that Rob Van Dam is on the short list of most impressive wrestlers I've ever seen. And Sabu, there is not enough love, credit, respect, honor, accolades that go to Sabu. There is no more influential and important wrestler to what we see to this day, almost 30 years later, to the style of wrestling that's prevailed since, to what would go on to be the Attitude Era in WWE, to what would go on for every company in wrestling adopting some of it. Sabu is the genesis. Sabu to pro wrestling would be the equivalent of the first pitcher that ever threw a curveball. He would be like the first time a quarterback threw a forward pass. Were there people doing hardcore before Sabu? There was. Were there people doing high flying moves before Sabu? There definitely was. Were there people that were doing it in the style of Sabu? The style that you may know the Hardy Boys to do. The style that Darby Allin does today. No. Sabu was absolutely reckless with his body, and he's paying for it now. He's in a lot of pain and has a lot of medical issues. But the things he was willing to do with his body for my entertainment and your entertainment are the stuff of legends. And he's not brought up and he's not honored as much as he should be. Rob Van Dam gets a lot of flowers. Sabu, not so much. And Rob, because Rob had to run WWE and even his runs in TNA. But I'd be willing to bet if you asked Rob Van Dam to answer honestly, if he thinks he's more influential or if he thinks Sabu is, he's going to point to Sabu. You may not even recognize it. You may not even notice when you watch a Will Ospreay match that a lot of what's being done by Ospreay was innovated by Sabu. He's just that special. And this was just a great match, and I'm not diminishing Rob Van Dam in any way. He's fantastic too. I just feel we need to take the spotlight, shine it a little bit over to show some light on a guy that doesn't get the light shined on him that he absolutely deserves. Ultimately, Sabu picks up the win here. Both men get stretchered out, which I believe led to a stretcher match later on. Sabu refuses the stretcher to go off the show, which obviously the fans ate up and loved. I thought this was absolutely fantastic. I'm giving it a 5. Overall, I thought the show was very good. Were there some things I didn't quite like? Yeah. The Dudley Boys FBI match I felt like was a little bit of nothing. The shoot fight between Taz and Paul Varlins, same thing. But this was ECW. You're throwing anything at the wall and seeing what sticks. Sometimes you hit a home run. Sometimes you strike out. I think there were more home runs on this show between the Sabu and Van Dam match, Raven and Terry Gordy's match, Jericho and Pitbull number 2, the angle with Raven and Tyler Fullington and Sandman's wife, the comedy of Stevie Richards and the Blue Meanie. This to me is a quintessential ECW show. This is one of those shows where if someone said, I don't get ECW, I've never watched it, point me to something that I could watch that explains it. This to me would explain it. You have great wrestling, you have great brawling, you have some hits, you have some misses, you have some of the biggest stars that ever did it in ECW with Sandman, Dreamer, Raven, Taz, Shane Douglas is on the card, the Dudley Boys. You have great up-and-coming talent like Jericho and Rob Van Dam, who weren't as big as they would be here. You had a legend like Terry Gordy getting one last chance at greatness. This is a fantastic thing. I'm giving the sum of the parts a 5. Again, it was very entertaining. That being said, if you made it to the end here, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. And if you see where it says join, that's how you become a channel member. We have memberships starting off as low as 99 cents. It would definitely help out the channel if you'd like to do that. If you made it here to the end, let's throw Bam Bam in the comments for Terry Gordy. Give him a little bit of love for his last great match. My name is George Coles. This has been another It Came From The Network.